The badge of change. It was a humid afternoon in the small town of Somerset, USA. The diner, Riley's Roadhouse, was a fixture of the community, an old, worn-down establishment with red leather booths, dim lighting, and a menu that hadn't changed since the 1970 set. The kind of place that had its regulars, many of whom were not quick to accept outsiders. Sasha Thompson, a black woman in her early 30s, walked in, her footsteps firm and steady. Her black leather jacket swayed as she moved, a stark contrast against the faded decor. Sasha had driven through the town on her way to a case, a long trip that had her looking for a place to eat. Her GPS had guided her here, and now, as she stepped through the door, she realized she might have walked into a town that wasn't too friendly to people who didn't look like its usual patrons. The moment Sasha entered, every single pair of eyes in the room turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The silence in the diner was palpable. Sasha had grown accustomed to being stared at, but there was something in the air today, a tension that felt thick enough to cut with a knife. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her presence commanding the room. The waitress, an older woman with tightly curled gray hair and a stiff posture, was the first to approach her. The woman's eyes darted nervously between Sasha and the other customers, as if she wasn't quite sure how to handle the situation. Can I help you?" she asked hesitantly, almost as though the words were foreign to her lips. Sasha smiled but didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket. The metallic gleam caught the light, sending a subtle but unmistakable signal to everyone in the room. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Sasha was not just any visitor. She was a federal civil rights investigator, one of the few who had earned a reputation for taking on the tough cases, especially those involving communities where prejudice ran deep. Her badge wasn't just a symbol of her job. It was a reminder of the years of work she'd put into making a difference, one case at a time. It carried weight, history, and authority. As soon as the badge was visible, a ripple of recognition spread through the room. The regulars, who had once whispered and shifted uncomfortably at her presence, suddenly became quieter. Some even looked away. The waitress blinked, her posture loosening slightly. She stepped back, no longer sure whether to offer Sasha a menu or ask her to leave. "Can I get a seat by the window?" Sasha asked calmly, her voice cool and collected. "And I'll take a cup of coffee." "Black, please." The waitress, almost as if snapping out of a trance, nodded quickly. She pointed to an empty booth near the window and began to walk away, her hands shaking as she grabbed the coffee pot. As Sasha settled into her seat, the rest of the diner remained eerily still. The people who had once made the place feel hostile were now staring at her, unsure of how to react. Sasha didn't mind. She wasn't there for them. She was there for a different purpose. The waitress came back with the coffee, her hands still trembling as she set the cup on the table. She didn't ask if Sasha needed anything else. She just turned and walked away, leaving Sasha in peace. But as the minutes passed, the mood in the diner slowly shifted. The tension that had once been thick in the air seemed to dissolve, if only slightly. People began to murmur quietly amongst themselves, but there was no longer any visible hostility. A few curious glances were thrown in her direction, but they were less judgmental, more inquisitive. The diner, once a fortress of exclusion, had taken a step toward change. Sasha didn't need to say a word to anyone. Her presence and that simple badge had done more than any speech could. It had reminded the people of Somerset that there were forces beyond their small town, forces that saw the world differently, forces that wouldn't tolerate injustice. By the time Sasha finished her coffee and stood to leave, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. The once frozen faces now seemed uncertain but thoughtful. Some even nodded in her direction as she walked to the door. As she stepped outside into the heat of the afternoon, Sasha didn't look back. She knew the battle wasn't won in that diner. But the seeds of change had been planted, and change had to start somewhere, even if it was just one diner at a time.